Hannibal Barca is most famous for his 17-year struggle against Rome during the Second Punic War. He inflicted several crushing defeats upon the Romans, culminating at the Battle of Cannae, where anywhere between 50 to 70,000 Romans perished. Despite the devastating losses, Rome clung on and eventually took the war to the Carthaginian heartland of Africa. Hannibal's winning streak finally ran out at the Battle of Zama, where he was defeated by Scipio Africanus, thus bringing the Second Punic War to an end. As Rome's greatest enemy, this begs an interesting question. What did Hannibal do after his time fighting the Romans was over? For starters, Hannibal survived his defeat at Zama, and afterwards he began the agonising process of suing for peace with Rome. Some of his more zealous countrymen wanted to fight on, but Hannibal urged them to accept Rome's terms, no matter how harsh they may be. It might not have been glorious, but it was an admirable and undervalued act of statesmanship, especially coming from a man who had lost one of his eyes and both of his brothers in the wars with Rome. As painful as it was, the alternative was destruction. Although that probably didn't make it any less of a bitter pill to swallow. Carthage lost vast swathes of territory in the peace terms. It had to release all Roman prisoners without ransom while ransoming its own, it had to pay a war indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver, and its fleet was restricted to just 10 ships. These terms were undeniably harsh, but Hannibal strongly argued for their acceptance. On one occasion, he even manhandled a Carthaginian senator who tried to make a speech in favour of defiance, and dragged him down from the podium. When he was later questioned about this event, he merely replied that his time on the warpath had caused him to forget political niceties. Hannibal's realism soon won his countrymen round, and Carthage accepted the terms. So that was that. The war was over, and Hannibal got to work guiding his city through the peace. On the face of it, 10,000 talents of silver was a hefty sum, and although Carthage's territorial empire was gone, its trade empire was still bringing in lots of cash, so Carthage enjoyed a period of great prosperity after the war's end. With this in mind, Hannibal was sure that his city could easily pay off the indemnity if corruption and inefficiency was cut out of the Carthaginian state. In 196, 5 years after the peace, Hannibal was elected as suffet, an office that could crudely be compared with the Roman consulship, with each year 2 suffets being elected. In the aftermath of the war, Hannibal was still a heavyweight political figure in Carthage, possessing the popularity and respect that most war heroes do. He also seemed to campaign on a somewhat populist platform. Once he became suffet in 196, he passed through several reforms to the Carthaginian Republic. Firstly, he came down hard on the corruption of the elite, in order to save money, and secondly, he altered the way that the Council of 104 worked. In essence, the Council of 104 was a council of, 104. It was composed of powerful aristocrats and could be thought of a bit like the Roman Senate. It was a staunchly conservative oligarchical body, so Hannibal changed the way that people got into the council. Prior to his reforms, membership was held for life and determined by wealth, but now you had to be elected to the council, and you could only hold power for 1 year. This meant that the old aristocracy lost power, as new blood was constantly being infused into the political system. These reforms weakened the power of the aristocracy and earned Hannibal many powerful enemies in Carthage. His term as suffet ended in 195, leaving him more vulnerable to his enemies, and to make things worse, a Roman embassy was on its way. In the wake of the Punic Wars, the Romans would never quite forget Hannibal and all the humiliations he had given them. In the centuries that followed, he achieved legendary status in Rome as its greatest enemy. The sense of begrudging respect tinged with paranoia was already beginning to manifest, and the Romans were worried about Carthage's resurgence and possible contacts between Hannibal and the Seleucid king Antiochus III. The Roman delegation thus demanded that Carthage hand over Hannibal. Hannibal didn't doubt that there were many in Carthage that would relish such an opportunity, but he didn't intend on giving them the chance. So he fled voluntarily into exile. He quietly slipped onto the first ship east, back to the ancient homeland of the Carthaginians. Hannibal was 52 years old as he watched Carthage and everything he had fought so hard to protect sink over the horizon. He would never return. Instead, he embarked on a tour of the east, visiting several of the greatest cities in the Seleucid Empire. First was Tyre, the city whose colonists had first settled Carthage many centuries ago. Then Antioch, the Seleucid capital and the greatest city in Syria. And finally he arrived at Ephesus on the Ionian seaboard. It was good timing too, for the Seleucid king was also in town. Hannibal was warmly welcomed by Antiochus III, but trouble seemed to follow him wherever he went, and his arrival coincided with an increase in tensions between Rome and the Seleucid Empire, as Antiochus began to take more of an active interest in Greece. As a side note, Hannibal's time at the Seleucid court also produced my favourite historical tale. In the interlude between the Punic and Seleucid wars, Scipio Africanus, the victor of Zama, travelled to the Seleucid court on a diplomatic mission. And who else just happened to be in the Seleucid court at this time? None other than Hannibal himself, Scipio's old enemy. So the two old foes met face to face once again, this time in friendlier circumstances. They eventually fell into conversation, and perhaps unsurprisingly, their discussions drifted onto the topic of generalship. In particular, Scipio was interested in who Hannibal thought was the greatest general of all time. First on Hannibal's list was Alexander the Great, king of Macedon and conqueror of Persia. Scipio agreed, for he too believed that Alexander's achievements could not be beat. Then in second place, Hannibal chose Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of Rome's most ambitious early foes, whose costly victories eventually led to the word Pyrrhic, meaning a victory that was just as bad as a defeat. Scipio, who clearly thought quite highly of himself, was annoyed by this choice. He finally asked who Hannibal would place third, fully expecting that he would concede at least third place to him. But in third place, Hannibal chose himself. With his jealousy now fully piqued, Scipio snarkily asked Hannibal where he would have placed himself if he had beaten Scipio at Zama. The Carthaginian replied that in that case he should have been first, ahead of even Alexander. In this way, Hannibal slyly complimented Scipio by suggesting that he had beaten someone even greater than Alexander. Apparently the two generals reconciled. And while this story may or may not be true, it's nevertheless a pretty cool crossover between these two giants that bestrode the ancient world. Anyway, we return to the action in 192 when war breaks out between Rome and the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid king took Hannibal on as a military advisor, but for the duration of the war he made pitiful use of him. I mean, Antiochus literally had the greatest general and Roman killer alive at the time on his council, and he barely did anything. Unsurprisingly, the Romans gained the upper hand in the war and drove Antiochus from Greece. It was only now that Hannibal was given any sort of command, but he was only made the admiral of a small navy, which he led to defeat in the naval battle of Eurymedon against the Rhodians. Hannibal's defeat here meant that he couldn't link up with the rest of the Seleucid navy, which was eventually defeated at the Battle of Meonissus. The Roman allied navy now controlled the Aegean, which opened up Asia Minor for invasion. So it was that Hannibal could only watch as the Romans launched their offensive against Antiochus in 190 and brought the king to battle at Magnesia. The Romans won another stonking great victory, and as part of the back-breaking peace terms, Hannibal was to be handed over to the Romans. It seemed his luck had finally run out, but once again Hannibal was too quick for his enemies, and he fled first to Armenia before travelling on to the court of King Prusias of Bithynia. He served Prusias diligently and well in his wars against the neighbouring king of Pergamon, who had been given most of Seleucid Asia Minor. By now, however, the Romans were determined to capture their old enemy once and for all, and they threatened King Prusias into handing him over. It was the end of the road. Hannibal was now in his 60s, and he was tired of running. There are a few stories of how the great general died. The main one is that, once the Romans located him and surrounded his castle, he took his life with poison, while others say that it was Prusias who poisoned him to appease the Romans. Others, less gloriously, maintain that he died of a scratch that resulted in a fever, which eventually took his life. Regardless of how it happened, Hannibal, the hero of Cannae and the terror of the Romans, met his end in a lonely fort in Bithynia. It was not a glorious end, but considering the horrors he might experience at Roman hands, it was probably the best outcome. So Hannibal ended his life the same way he lived it, getting one over on the Romans. He was buried in Labissa in Bithynia. In the years that followed, Carthage entered a period of peace and prosperity, although Hannibal's home city would only outlive him by 4 decades, with the Romans obliterating it in 146 BC.